Greetings, and welcome back to part 2 of our Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised 12th edition. My name's Dakota James Owen Keeler, and today we're going to be covering the introduction to the book. Now, I didn't cover the whole introduction. I've only pulled out pieces and parts of it, because this is going to be, hopefully, one of the longer videos, and the rest will get a bit shorter from here on out. So, one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is Robert's Rules of Order newly combined? Well, it's a codification of the present-day general parliamentary law, and it's a manual meant to be adopted by organizations or assemblies as their parliamentary authority, and if so adopted, within it, the rules, with any special rules of procedure, become binding upon that body and constitute that body's rules of order. Now, what that means for the average folk is that these are just the rule book. Like you have rules for tennis or baseball or football and so on. These are the rules for a meeting, and we got it nicely in one 699-page book. Now, this brings us a question. We just talked about parliamentary law, that it's a codification of it, and that it acts as its parliamentary authority. Well, what is parliamentary law? Well, it's the rules and customs for carrying out business in the English Parliament, and it was developed through a continuing process of decisions or precedents, somewhat like the common law. Now, what that means is circumstance A happens. Now, we don't have a rule for A yet, and so we have to devise a new rule, like what are we going to do? And then that rule becomes part of the precedent or history of the body and has more authority next time a situation like A happens. Now, the origins of parliamentary law. It is believed by Thucydides, and I probably murdered that, in his History of the Peloponnesian War. He cites numerous examples of local cities being decided by vote, where people would come together and say, okay, should we do X? All in favor say aye. And he recorded the first known instance of the division of the assembly when Sparta declared war on Athens. Now, English parliamentary law is believed to be traced back to the Anglo-Saxon tribes before their migration to the islands of Britain in the 5th century AD. So, in the Germanic tribes, it is believed that they came together in the village moot, and they made their own bylaws for their village and the administration of justice. Then they would choose men to represent them at the 100th moot, which is like a couple villages combined together, and then they would represent them further still in the folk moot, which is like a citizen army of the tribes. Now, when this came over to Anglo-Saxon England, it later emerged as the Shire Moot, and it's found to be an instrument of local government subject to Crown supervision, under the advice of the National Assembly known as the Witan or Witten Moot, originally established in each of the separate early English kingdoms. It was supposed to include all free men who held land. The king's authority was said to derive from the consent of the Witan, and the king's authority was held to derive from the Witan's consent, and it might exert influence over the choice of a new king. The Norman kings assembled councils composed of court officials, barons, and prelates, of whom the number present depended on the importance of what was going on. This was known as the Great Council, and it was considered as the constitutional continuation of the Witten Moot. In the 13th and early 14th century, that's when it started to be converted into Parliament. Parliament at the time just means any important meeting held for the purpose of discussion. And the distinguishing feature of the early parliaments was the fact that the barons were invited not only to express their opinions individually, but to discuss with each other the overall state of the realm. And in 1275, we got the first National Commons, which was held by Edward I. Now, the Commons were usually summoned for issues of taxes, and that was only when the barons wanted the common people to support them. However, after 1311, the commons were in attendance at every parliament. Then, we get to parliamentary procedure being brought to America. So, each colony brought over, at different times, the latest and greatest parliamentary procedure. And then we had to adopt it to our local charters. Some charters allowed for this, some charters allowed for that. And this new type of self-government was particular to America because England had an unwritten constitution, and we were operating more as corporations. Now, this large variety of procedure was one of the conditions that led to the development of Robert's rules. Now, before we get to Robert's, we got Jefferson's manual. Now, he was concerned when he was the presiding officer of the Senate from 1791 to 1801 that the Senate didn't really have a worked out system of rules, and often they would appeal to the president to make a decision, and there was no appeal from the president, and he made decisions on almost everything. And Jefferson thought that this could be abused if they had no set of known rules to refer back to. But what should those rules be? And Parliament, Jefferson viewed as the go-to reference, because it's the model they all studied, but they were little acquainted with it, how each state had adopted it. Now, Jefferson published his manual in 1801, and it gained importance and authority because people started adopting it, both the Senate and state legislatures. And it's unchallenged as our first attempt to define and interpret parliamentary principles for our democratic republic. But later in the scene walks on Cushing. Now, he was a clerk of the Massachusetts House of Representatives and a noted jurist. Now, he wanted a parliamentary manual that was fitting for the average person. So, your churches, your political, your scientific, etc. Because Jefferson's manual was more legislative in notion, and it didn't really fit well with the ordinary societies. And he noted a few things. First, the length of the session. That is, most meetings are a couple hours, maybe a day if that. Most members in ordinary societies can't be compelled to attend. They can be in a legislature. And the sheer amount of business is magnitude smaller in your ordinary society than it is in a legislature. And so one-to-one adoption of the rules doesn't make sense. Now, Cushing had a few observations. That Jefferson's manual was the common parliamentary law in the country. Each state made their own modifications of it, and some ordinary meetings were held by the common parliamentary law, but with a few modifications to it from each state. Now, Cushing thought it was an error to take the state's modifications, but instead they should just be bound by the common parliamentary law and any rules they themselves adopt. And then Cushing, in his manual, wanted to give some basic procedure and leave it for the group to write their own rules of order for anything not covered in the absolute basic. But this proved too much for most groups. Now, this leads into the genesis of Robert's rules. Sorry about that. Now, Robert, he first became interested in parliamentary law from 1863 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he was asked to preside over a meeting, which he has never done before to that point. And the topic of the meeting was a possible Confederate attack from the sea. This meeting lasts 14 hours, and when he came out, he, quote, "My embarrassment was supreme," end quote. He wrote, "I plunged in trusting to Providence that the assembly would behave itself, but with the plunge went the determination that I would never attend another meeting unless I knew something of parliamentary law." He then started carrying a slip of paper in his pocket, and with it, he had a few motions, the order of precedence, whether they can be debated or not debated, and so on. But when he was stationed in San Francisco, his wife and him took part in a lot of local groups, religious and non-religious. And he noticed as people started flowing in, and as Crushing pointed out, a lot of these bodies used their own state's modifications of parliamentary law, that people were arguing more over what was parliamentary law than what wasn't. Now, Robert thought that assemblies would be better served if we had a better agreement as to what constituted parliamentary law. In his own words, "So I inquired at the largest bookstore for the best books in the subjects. Crushing's manual was handed me, and also Wilson's Digest, a book containing about 2,400 decisions made in the English Parliament and our Congress. Then I sent for the Congressional Manual, which contained Jefferson's Manual, the Rules of the House of Representatives, and Barclay's Digest of Rules and Practices of the House. A careful reading of these books showed that it was not an easy matter to decide what was parliamentary law. For instance, both Jefferson and Crushing gave an equal rank to the motion for the previous question and to postpone definitely and indefinitely, and to commit. The House of Representatives make them rank thus: previous question, postponed definitely, commit, amend, postponed indefinitely, at the foot of the list. And the Senate does not allow the previous question, and instead of placing indefinitely postpone at the foot, it puts it at the head of the list. So we have some motions that are allowed, some that aren't, and the order is a bit different. Also, if a motion to strike out a paragraph is lost, the paragraph can afterward be amended according to the rules and practice of both houses of Congress. But it could not be amended according to Jefferson and Crushing and the practice of the English Parliament. In Congress, the question will be stated and put on strike out the paragraph, whereas according to the other authorities, it should be put on whether the paragraph shall stand as part of the resolution. Again, as to debate, the U.S. Senate allowed each member to speak twice on the same day to the same question without any limit as to the time. All other authorities allowed only one speech from each member on any question, and the House of Representatives also limited that speech to 1 hour. That seems like a lot. Also, in Congress, certain motions are undebatable, whereas the other authorities did not allude to such a thing as an undebatable motion, except that Crushing said in a note that legislative bodies usually, to quote, provide that certain questions, as for example to adjourn, to lay on the table for previous question, or the order of business, shall be decided without debate. These examples will show the difficulties in the way of anyone who was anxious to know enough parliamentary law to enable him to cooperate with others in effective work in lines in which he was interested. So you can see there's a few problems with that. We don't have a clear example of what is and is not acceptable. Our authorities on the subject disagree with each other, and it leads to a bunch of confusion. This later led him to create a pamphlet about 16 pages, and he started to try it out. It had some good responses, but he soon realized that it would not solve the problem if a couple of societies here and there had their own rules. And so this led to a few conclusions. 1. In a country at large, the average society would find it difficult to have an adequate set of rules of order, prepared specially for its own use, as Crushing had apparently expected it to do. Remember, he wanted only the basics in each society to come up with its own rules. 2. Even if a society were in a position to work out a satisfactory set of rules, this would only create further multiplicity, and thus there would be more fraction, and it would be harder for people of different communities to come together and work. 3. Conditions in ordinary societies, different as the purpose of those societies might be, were sufficiently similar from a parliamentary point of view to be guided by practically the same rules. 4. As far as any trend could be seen, it appeared that the best presiding officers were following the practice of the U.S. House of Representatives on basic points, such as the order of precedence of motions, which motions could be debated, and so on. The practice of the House was then approaching an established form after marked evolution during the preceding decades. during which it became considerably different from the old common parliamentary law as laid down by Jefferson and Cushing. Now, Robert wasn't able to start writing until 1874, and he started his printing in 1875 with the help of his wife, and a new part for people who were not familiar with meetings, under her recommendation. At this point, he printed 4,000 copies, and he could only secure a publishing contract by making some unusual concessions. Now, this was because the publisher had great skepticism of whether these would even sell. Now, he agreed to pay for the binding of all 4,000 copies, and then he agreed to give 1,000 copies away throughout the country to parliamentarians, known as parliamentarians, to churches, to political groups, and etc. Now, this is where something unexpected happened. The first edition of the manual sold out in 4 months, and he expected it to take 2 years to sell. And the publisher, Griggs and Company of Chicago, gave it the title Robert's Rules of Order, and this was the short title printed on the manual. Now, this pocket edition is kind of rare today. Now, what's really cool is his family to this day still maintains and updates the work in accordance with Robert's wishes. It went from his son, who had very little impact in it, to his wife, and then to the grandchild, who his great-grandchild recently passed away, and so on. And it will probably continue to stay within the family, and that's really cool. Now, for the last question of the video, why learn it? Robert had a great quote, he attributed this quote to often being heard. The great lessons for democracies is for the majority to give to the minority a full, free opportunity to present their side of the case, and then for the minority, having failed to win a majority of their views, gracefully to submit and recognize the actions as that of the entire organization, and cheerfully to assist in carrying it out until they can secure its repeal. This is fundamentally important, not only to our system of government as a constitutional republic, but to your churches, your voluntary societies, your nonprofits. If the minority doesn't have a fair chance to say its full side, they will not submit under any circumstance. They will feel railroaded, they will feel like they're not important, and they will become roadblocks. But if you give them the proper ability to fully express their case, then they are more likely to not only submit, but to submit in a helpful way. And they can always continue on their argument until they can convince the majority that they should repeal that action. With that, the introduction video is over. I hope that you have a good day, and I look forward to seeing you in Section 1 of Robert's Rules of Order. Have a good day, and goodbye.